Hello and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the Siegel Executive Director of the Institute. Today marks a special day, a day of memory, as we pause today in advance of the October 7th anniversary of the assault that Hamas made across Israel's southern border into communities, villages, towns, and began a year that has transformed the Middle East. Some dates get engraved in one's memory. One doesn't have to say much more. December 7th, 1941, September 11th, 2001. In the Middle East, October 7th, 2023 is one such date. Today, we are focusing here at the Washington Institute not on everything that was, not on all the change that was triggered by October 7th, but on how October 7th had an impact on American Middle East policy, on the changes that were triggered by that event and what has occurred over the past year. The direct fighting in Gaza, the multiple fronts of conflict that we have seen just recently, extend all the way to just the yesterday's barrage of Iranian missiles against Israel. So today we're going to focus on the American impact of October 7th with my colleagues, three colleagues that have had an intimate role in the shaping and execution of American Middle East policy in the current administration and going back administrations for decades in the past. We're fortunate here at the Institute to have such a range of policy expertise on the full-time professional staff, and I'm very happy to be able to turn to them for their views today on how October 7th has impacted American policy so far and what might be the direction of impact as we begin year two of the post-October 7th world in the Middle East. On my immediate left is the Institute's Davidson Distinguished Fellow, Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis, of course, has served at high levels of the executive branch from the Reagan and Bush through the Clinton and Obama administrations. A sadly rare example of bipartisanship at high levels of government. One doesn't see much in public life today. Sitting to Dennis's left is the Institute's Casson Family Fellow, our Director of Research now at the Washington Institute, Dana Stroll, who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East in the Biden administration, and played a critical role in all aspects of America's security and military response in the days and months following October 7th. And then on her left is the Institute's Taubey Family Senior Fellow, David Schenker. David served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs in the Trump administration under Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And David, of course, has had many years of experience dealing firsthand with the challenges of terrorism throughout the Levant, throughout the Middle East, and with a special expertise on Lebanon and confronting Hezbollah. So we have lots to talk about today. I'm going to ask each of my colleagues to make some opening remarks, and then I will turn to questions. I invite your questions. Please feel free to send them in either through the Q&A bar on your Zoom screen, or if you're engaging in today's event through some other platform, please feel free to email me directly at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org. With that, I'll turn to you, Dennis.
All right. Thanks, Rob. If we go back to October 6th of a year ago, and we look at the administration's view of the region and what it was doing, that was a moment of high expectation. We actually had heard a speech by a senior administration official to us, to the Institute, shortly before, talking about how calm the region was. There was a perception that we were on the brink of a Saudi normalization deal with Israel, which would be completely transformative, and a sense that a new Middle East was in the offing, and the sense of threat was largely seen as being, if not behind us, it was clearly diminished and reduced. So October 7th comes along and it transforms the region from another standpoint. Suddenly we're seeing not just a horrific event, but a war is launched. The U.S. adopts a position from the very beginning where the president goes, the only American president ever to go to Israel during wartime, as a way of demonstrating not rhetorically, but practically that we were shoulder to shoulder with the Israelis. We supported the Israelis. Over a period of time, obviously, more questions became, I think, visible in terms of American concerns about some of the Israeli strategies. But as we look at this now, almost a year later, we see on the one hand, the Israelis have pretty much reduced Hamas to a non-military threat in the sense that it's no longer a military, it still exists. It has decimated the leadership of Hezbollah, meaning two fronts that faced Israel prior to October 7th have been fundamentally transformed. And now, as you mentioned, in the aftermath of the barrage on Israel, Israel clearly will retaliate in some fashion. So from an American standpoint, what are we looking at? Even though it looks like we're in a region that is dramatically different, characterized by conflict, certainly not one that looks like you can avoid escalation, and yet we're also seeing the most important proxy of the Iranians. And when I say the most important, that almost understates it. The Hezbollah trained all the other proxies in the region. They were the shock troops for the Iranians in Syria. When you reduce Hezbollah that way, when Hamas can't be the kind of threat it was, when Iran itself is likely to be weakened as a result of what we've seen, this actually creates an opportunity for the United States to focus on how you might be able to remake Lebanon and reassert the sovereignty of the state over the non-state actor that basically paralyzed it or held it, controlled what the Lebanese government could do. The ability, I think, to transform the region, if in fact it's possible for the Israelis and us working with the Israelis to focus on war termination in Gaza, war termination in Lebanon, the ability to go back to that Saudi-Israeli normalization deal in a context where Iran itself has been threatened, and what they call the axis of resistance, what I call actually the axis of misery, because there isn't a state in that or non-state actor in that setting that offers anything for the future, any prospect. So in this context, if you can focus on war termination, and we can get into how one might do that, then ironically, we may be back to where we were in the pre-October 7th period in terms of being to reshape the region in a fundamental way. I view this, and I'll conclude with this, the decimation of the Hezbollah leadership has created an opportunity, not just for Lebanon, but for the U.S. and the region, and for the Israelis, if they can look at their military achievements from the standpoint of also focused on how you produce political outcomes. Focusing on that could well create a strategic opening in the region.
Okay, thank you. A potential moment of opportunity for U.S. leadership to make positive change. Dana.
Thanks so much, Rob, and pleasure to be on this panel, yet on such a somber one-year commemoration. What I'd like to start with is first an observation that the hallmarks of the U.S. approach to the region have remained steady and consistent even over the past year. So when one thinks to 2021 and the beginning of the Biden administration and how senior administration officials articulated their approach to the region, the words one heard were diplomacy, de-escalation, integration, and military force as a last resort, not a first choice. I would argue that those themes have remained quite consistent since Hamas's October 7th attack. This Washington has leaned into diplomacy while supporting Israel's right to defend itself, always pushing for the tell me how it ends. What is the political outcome that translates military and operational achievements into sustainable changes that are enduring not only for Israel's security, but stabilizing for the region? De-escalation is a word much discussed here and across the region. Still, clearly, we hear that across all statements and urging from Washington to prevent a full-scale regional war and focus on de-escalation and integration. Even 1 year after the Hamas attacks, the administration continues active diplomacy to keep initiatives like Saudi-Israel normalization on the table and pursue greater operational integration between Israel and its Arab neighbors in the region. So point number one, consistency in how the administration views what it's doing in the region. Excuse me. Number two, despite having said that, the past year of a U.S. approach to the region has seen a remarkable journey in the use of military force and the use of the military instrument, and also how the administration thinks about U.S. military posture. So first, we've seen different applications of U.S. military force. The first, of course, is how we have supported the Israel Defense Forces in their actions. Number two, in late 2023 into early 2024, is how President Biden directed unilateral U.S. force against facilities associated with the IRGC, then combatants, and then militia leaders, both in Syria and in Iraq. Separately, we've seen both the convening of a coalition in the Red Sea to monitor and support security of military and commercial vessels from Houthi aggression emanating from Yemen. And we've also separately seen U.S. convening of a multilateral coalition for offensive strikes to degrade Houthi capabilities so that they cannot continue to threaten freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. When you think back to 2021 and how the administration talked about right-sizing posture in the Middle East and how it was also focusing on the Europe theater and the Indo-Pacific theater, I think what we've seen in terms of commitment to the region and willingness to discard with previous plans and increase U.S. military posture dynamically, flexibly, and swiftly is quite remarkable. How many times has the Pentagon decided to either extend the deployment of an aircraft carrier or send a new aircraft carrier or direct an aircraft carrier to accelerate its progress toward the Middle East theater? We started before on October 6th with about 30,000 U.S. forces in the region. The current estimate is about 43,000 forces in the U.S. region. Just yesterday, new announcements of fighter aircraft squadrons being deployed to the Middle East and more U.S. forces here at home on prepare to deploy orders. That's just a significant investment of resources and personnel signaling enduring U.S. commitment to the region. And given criticism of U.S. posture and the desire to reduce some of it in the Middle East, the fact that the administration, again, has been willing to increase as a signal of deterrence commitment to Israel's defense, I think is just a remarkable and a point that really should be underscored in how Washington has approached the past year in the Middle East. Finally, observations about the region. On the one hand, there are certain pillars of regional stability that have been promoted, encouraged, and sought to be strengthened by the United States that remain today. Israel's peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, facilitation of contacts with the leadership in Amman and Cairo, the Abraham Accords agreements with Morocco, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, the U.S. commitment to operational integration, such as the Air Defense Coalition that could only have come together with U.S. leadership to defend against the Iranian complex attack in mid-April. All of these things are still on the table, and I think that's just remarkable and worthy of exploration 1 year later. And finally, a note of humility. We've seen so many black swans in the last year, events that we did not predict that should cause both reassessment of assumptions in the Middle East here in Washington, across the region with our allies and partners in Europe. For example, that Hamas was willing to execute an attack on October 7th of such brutality to take hostages, that Iran was willing to cross the threshold in April from projecting force through proxies and non-state actors to a direct attack, that the Israel Defense Forces could execute such a remarkably successful decapitation strategy against Hezbollah senior leadership, and then that the regime in Tehran just yesterday decided to execute a quite extensive ballistic missile attack very quickly. All of these are events that we were not necessarily planning for before October 7th, and should, I think, going forward, cause us to rethink what are the risks and what are the opportunities and how U.S. policy looks at the Middle East.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob. Pleasure to be with you all today. October 7th, I think, changed everything. Israel very quickly realized the significance of the date. I think it took a little longer for it to sink in Washington. I remember in the aftermath of the attack, the Biden administration State Department, I think, pulled a page from its playbook, its traditional playbook. They tweeted immediately, "We unequivocally condemn the attack of Hamas terrorists and the loss of life that's been incurred. We urge all sides to refrain from violence and retaliatory attacks. Terror and violence solve nothing." I think after realizing the dramatic scale and depravity of the attack, the State Department very quickly pulled this tweet down. And since then, I think the administration has been lockstep, really, or at least for the first 6-7 months after the attack, with Israel in its campaign against Hamas. And the abiding principle, which has informed U.S. support, has been that Hamas essentially can no longer govern Gaza. While differences have emerged over humanitarian relief and Israel's specific targeting choices, the support has been solid, and there had been, I think, really limited daylight between Washington and Jerusalem. But over time, I think concerns about spillover, the broadening of the conflict grew. We had Americans killed in January in Jordan. You had Israel hit a senior IRGC official in Damascus. You had the Iranians respond with missile attack against Israel. We saw increased Houthi involvement. And Washington became, I think, the administration became increasingly focused on de-escalation. And we saw, I think, the daylight grow, and a series of misunderstandings about ceasefire proposals, both within on Gaza and on Lebanon. And now we have the latest Iranian targeting of Israel with ballistic missiles. More profound change has really been in Israel. October 7th changed Israel entirely. The complacency, I think, that led to October 7th has vanished. Israel's more proactive and aggressive in its self-defense, facing existential threats in a 7-front war. Israel is seemingly less concerned with international public opinion. It's willing to escalate and accept the consequences, has a greater acceptance of risk. You see this in the targeting at the beginning of the campaign in Lebanon after they were attacked, killing a senior Hamas leader in Beirut, hitting Damascus, hitting Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, eliminating the entire Hezbollah Jihad Council, the pager and walkie-talkie operation of the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. Along these lines, I think it's fair to say that the Mossad has gotten its mojo back. Gaza was a relatively blind spot, I think, because Israeli intelligence assessments were wrong, and so little attention had been paid. But in Lebanon, since October 8th, it's been an entirely different story. I think the Israeli military intelligence and the Mossad learned the lesson of 2006, when the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, had limited target sets, and they lacked the deep knowledge and infiltration of Hezbollah. But over the past 17 years, Israel has clearly done its homework. We saw that in spades in recent weeks, but also in how Israel operated in Lebanon since right after October 8th of 2023. So going forward, I think for Israel and the next U.S. administration in the coming year, whether that's Harris administration or Trump administration, I think there are going to be significant challenges. First and most immediately, Israel is not going to take the win on interdicting Iran's last missile barrage. There are big questions about where the United States is going to be on Iran, its nuclear program, and its proxies, and whatever the next administration will be. And just as parenthetically, I think the Waltz-Vance vice presidential debate last night wasn't particularly heartening in that regard. The U.S. is also heretofore, I think, as Dana mentioned, or not exactly mentioned, but sort of has absolved itself. The United States has absolved itself really of from the Houthi problem in Bab el-Mandeb and securing freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. That's going to be something that the next administration may have to deal with. I think also, as Dana hinted at, there's going to be major challenges, I think, for U.S. force posture, whether we're going to continue to be able to have the type of forces and assets in the Middle East when we have growing challenges elsewhere, particularly in Asia. After a year of war, in the event of a wind down in ongoing kinetic operations in Gaza and Lebanon, there's going to be a lot of bigger sort of looming questions for Washington and Jerusalem. I recall back in 2003, while I was working in OSD policy at the Pentagon, a former and current senior Israeli government official said to me that Israel is a quote unquote strategy free zone. On this front, Israel is facing some major challenges on how to transform its battlefield successes into political victories. And this is an issue for the United States as well. On Gaza, I think we're going to see an end of Israeli operations sooner rather than later. I don't think Israel has any idea about what to do with the day after. Washington's going to have to play a major role in shaping that. I think on Lebanon, too, Washington will play an enormous role now that Hezbollah has been diminished. What can we do to consolidate the degradation of Iran's crown jewel? Can the U.S. press for rebalancing of Lebanon's political system? Eventually, will we be implementing, or can we implement 1701 or 1559 UN Security Council resolutions that call for a separation of Hezbollah forces and Israel forces, or a disarming of militias in Lebanon or terrorist organizations? If that doesn't happen, will Israel continue to operate in Lebanon as it has operated in Syria since 2013, continuously hitting Iranian assets in Lebanon? There are a lot of open questions after a year of basically ongoing war in the region since October 7th. And I look forward to talking about them right now.
Okay, very good. Thank you for laying all those out. Before I pose a few questions to my colleagues, again, let me invite those of you who are joining us online to send questions directly to me via email at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org, or if you're on Zoom, to use the Q&A function of your Zoom bar. So let me first ask a couple of questions about the past year and then about where we're going ahead. Dana, let me begin with you. When this began after October 7th, I mean, I can remember clearly the big debate in Washington is, will the president tire after, 2 months or 3 months? Will this be over by Thanksgiving or by Christmas? And yet it has gone on a year, and it will continue to go in different phases as far as the eye can see. In some sense, an absolutely remarkable display of American military support to Israel. It's a 360 days now where we're continuing to supply Israel with all sorts of stuff. And you described the various arenas in which we're now deeply engaged and deployed. Can you tell us a little bit about how this actually worked inside the Pentagon? This was not something that was part of what you planned to do, but yet it must have been such a all-consuming, event and changed everything that we did in terms of our deployments in the Middle East and its effect around the world.
Thanks for that. Very easy question, Rob. Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that from October 6th and earlier, one, because of Israel's entry into the operational responsibility of U.S. Central Command before Israel had been under the European Operational Command. There were just remarkable opportunities that we had been working on for years leading up to October 7th for how to facilitate greater military coordination between Israel and the Arab region, so the traditional U.S. partners, historical U.S. partners in the Middle East. And because when you think about the military leadership inside, I'm going to use the acronym now, CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM. When you think about how the military leadership and the forward deployed forces see the region, they in many ways see it the same way as Israel. And for years, there was a shared threat assessment about the region, that Iran is the center of gravity for destabilizing actions. There is agreement between Israel and its Arab neighbors on that it is Iran that is cultivating a network of violent non-state actors and proxies that sow chaos, corruption, instability, and challenge the resilience of central governments across the region. So you think about some of the very significant military exercises that had taken place prior to October 7th, the long history of U.S.-Israel defense cooperation, all of these things were happening beforehand. And Washington and Jerusalem had already been through one crisis, which was the 2021 Operation Guardian of the Wall. So how to communicate during fast-moving events, a lot of that connective tissue was already there. Part of what the Pentagon does is look at what we call the global employment of forces. So we look years into the future and think through, where do we need certain capabilities? What are the exercises that we want to do? And then, of course, part of the challenge is always building in enough flexibility to respond to crises, to respond to contingencies and unexpected events. So when we got to October 7th, it was very clear that not only was the Pentagon going to need to organize, not only across the entire Department of Defense, how to make sure Israel had what it needed to restore security in Israel and militarily dismantle Hamas, but that other elements of Iran's axis of resistance would likely try to escalate the conflict and see this as the opening or the opportunity to increase pressure on Israel and challenge the very existence of the Jewish democratic state in the Middle East. So number one, there was a view that an increase in posture to support both Israel's defense, but to signal commitment to preventing the expansion of that conflict was necessary. And the Pentagon demonstrated immediately that it was willing to change its planning that it had before and immediately deploy more capability, more assets. There was not an aircraft carrier in the Middle East until after October 7th. I think that's incredibly noteworthy. And again, this demonstration of resources and commitment. And then there had also been, of course, a lot of work on how to get enough equipment to another partner who was in an emergency situation, which was Ukraine after Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and its targeting of civilians. So again, there was already muscle memory about how to support a partner in a crisis. And we were able to take all of that and ramp it up very quickly.
Okay, so that was a question that focused on one of the most successful aspects of the past year. Dennis, I want to ask you on a question that a lot of critics are lobbing toward the administration on the diplomatic side, which is despite remarkable effort, consistent engagement, less success, inability to get a ceasefire in Gaza. The second don't do it to Iran was not heeded. The first one was after, or the first October 7th post, sending our military power to the region, urging actors not to Hezbollah, et cetera, not to broaden. That was heeded, but the second one came April. They did it, right. And they did it again.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about what seems to be the limitations of our diplomatic ability to bring about the political decisions that we're looking for?
It's a crucial question, and I think it's a reminder that diplomacy rarely works without effective leverage. The initial don'ts conveyed a threat that Iran didn't want to test. We can't say that, on the one hand, you can say it affected Hezbollah, but not much, because it was one day before they began to hit into Israel. They did it in a way that was designed to be contained because they didn't have an interest in an all-out war, but they did it nonetheless. What we're seeing more recently is that the Iranians, in terms of their calculus, decided on April 13th that because the Israelis had taken out a group of senior Revolutionary Guard officials in what the Iranians saw as a diplomatic facility in Damascus, that they were going to respond. And the American don't there, and there were all sorts of American warnings that were being made. What they contributed to was Iran, in effect, signaling what they were going to do, creating enough time so there could be defensive measures taken, but they could still make the kind of statement they wanted to make, which was they were going to act. They were trying to change the ground rules so Israel could not be going after their forces in Syria, even though they could have their forces in Syria. Now, the truth is, we helped the Israelis blunt that attack, for sure. We didn't want the Israelis. We wanted, you'll recall, President Biden said, take the win. Now, the Israelis, in a sense, took into account what we were suggesting, because the nature of their response, they waited a while, and then they took out a radar in a S-300 defensive missile system next to Isfahan, which was guarding, in effect, a very important bit of their nuclear infrastructure. Israel didn't hit the nuclear infrastructure, but it signaled, we can, because we just took out your defensive means to do that. So Israel was trying to signal with force about what the Iranians shouldn't do. We, in a sense, were still in a kind of defensive posture. And I think the message to the Iranians was, okay, the Americans will blunt what we do, but they won't impose a price on us. Diplomacy, to be effective, when I said it needs leverage, it means coercion. It means when you're affecting the calculus of someone else, and let's take the Iranians, they have to understand the price that we will impose is a price that matters to them. Not that we think should matter to them, but a price that matters to them. When the administration now says there will be severe consequences, because Jake Sullivan said yesterday, consequences, and he's repeated himself, said severe consequences, the Iranians need to understand that these are consequences that we don't measure as severe, but they would measure as severe. So it has implications for what we do. Now, is that, again, a non-military action, or does the U.S. take some kind of military action? By the way, the military action we take doesn't necessarily have to be directly against Iran. What if we reacted very differently to what we've been doing when it comes to the Houthis? What if we decided to say, okay, you've lost the effectiveness and the weight and the coercive capability of two of your proxies? What if we were to go after the Houthi leadership? This would send a message to the Iranians, we're taking away your assets. We are prepared to impose a price on you. If we want to affect the Iranian calculus, then we're going to have to go after things, not just rhetorically and not just through economic means, but be prepared to take some sort of military action. It should be informed. It should be smart. It should have a strategic objective in mind. But I'm suggesting one way to do that right now is to signal them, okay, we're going to weaken another one of your assets. Let's see how much you like that.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to some questions that people are sending in and connect it to some of the issues that all three of you have already raised, and some that I think we need to get into our conversation a year after October 7th. David, you listed quite a broad array of issues that any new administration is going to have to face, whether it's a Democratic or Republican victor next month. Can you give some prioritization? I mean, where would you start? You're a new administration coming in. You have a global agenda. You're dealt with. You have a series of urgent Middle East challenges. Where do you begin?
Well, it's a great question. I think there's a saying, if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. All these things are so important, right? So critical. So we're going to put aside the pivot to Asia. That's number one. That's going to be a constant for every administration. But I think after a year of war, and particularly given what has happened in Lebanon, and given how important this asset is to Iran, and given that this organization will undoubtedly reconstitute absent concerted international effort, I would put that almost on top of the list. I think you have longer term priorities coming after that, whether that's Iranian nuclear, which is obviously an existential issue, not only for Israel, but in terms of the end of the NPT in the region, right? If that's not taken care of, the Middle East becomes profoundly destabilized with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, other states getting a nuclear weapon. How you deal with that, whether that's via negotiation, whether that's through coercion, I'll leave that to the next administration. But that's something that also will take a concerted effort. And I think something that if you persist or have an enduring rollback of two of Iran's leading proxies in the region, one being Hezbollah, the other being Hamas, that makes, I think, it more conducive in a way to put forward this great effort on the Iranian nuclear front. After that, let's get back to basics. The United States responsibility ensuring freedom of navigation, Red Sea. And actually, I think part of that is because there are so many other priorities that we haven't really been focused on this effort. And I think there's going to have to be larger burden sharing in that regard. We have a lot of partners out there, but that's three. There's plenty more. Rebuilding Gaza, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, I just want to underscore what you said earlier in your opening remark about the exchange between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance last night. I think it may be the only, perhaps certainly one of the few presidential, vice presidential debates that began with a Middle East question. I can't recall any of them that actually.
You have to go back to Reagan and Carter.
A long way
Reagan
to begin with a Middle East question, and yet neither took the opportunity to repeat a line that presidents, Republican and Democratic, have been uttering for at least 15 years, which is no nuclear bomb on my watch.
Yeah.
George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, but we didn't hear it from either of them last night. Yeah. Dana, let me ask you about a different aspect of this. We're talking about a year of war. War affects people. It affects people in a terrible way. We obviously know what the impact on the Israeli people, October 7th and the days thereafter, horrible impact on civilians in Gaza, on Palestinian civilians, caught up in this war. Now we're seeing a very sad chapter for many Lebanese civilians that are, hostage in many ways to what Hezbollah has done in parts of Lebanon. How do you look at the American approach to addressing the civilian or humanitarian aspect of this year of conflict?
I think that a lot of times Washington's attention span is very short. And at this news cycle in the Middle East, it can feel like a decade or a century of news in every day. So it's easy to forget that one of the first things Washington did after October 7th, as it understood how Israel's operational plans were taking shape in Gaza, was to put one of our most capable, excuse me, most renowned ambassadors, recall him out of retirement, Ambassador David Satterfield, and put him in charge of a file that was only humanitarian affairs with respect to Gaza. And Ambassador Satterfield stayed in Israel, traveling around the region, back and forth to Egypt, to work on the minutia of humanitarian access to increase the amount of goods that could get into Gaza for Palestinian civilians. Then, of course, there were using the Air Force for live drops of humanitarian aid when access into northern Gaza became difficult. And then, of course, the maritime pier. So tremendous amount of effort by Washington to increase the amount of humanitarian aid going in. And of course, tremendous amounts of work with Israel on access, on opening up more points of entry. I also want to say something about, so number one, I want to emphasize how much work and how much consideration, and having been on the inside and seeing the daily work on what are the issues today with respect to humanitarian access, what do we need to be working with our partners in Israel on, and what do we need to be coordinating with other capitals with respect to the humanitarian situation and easing it. And despite the fact that it is absolutely abysmal today in Gaza, I think it's important to reflect on how international commitment, U.S. engagement, and U.S. commitment to that coordination role has had some remarkable, important milestones. The much talked about famine was prevented in Gaza. There was a polio vaccination campaign for children in Gaza that was successful in vaccinating children. This happens because I think of U.S. commitment and its commitment to working with others. I think it's important to just reflect on the demography of the Middle East. And one aspect of the post-October 7th environment that is so striking, and we talk a lot about here at the Washington Institute, is that inside Israel, they are still living in October 7th. They still have hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. And what Israeli media covers about what's happening compared to the outside voice, what is covered in the rest of the Arab world. So on those media channels and around those dinner tables, it's only a focus on Palestinian civilian suffering, not a lot of focus on Israeli suffering. And of course, now what's inescapable if you go across the region is the focus on Lebanon. The longer this goes on without support services for children, without healthcare, without school, we are setting back a generation. And the implications of that for long-term stability and what the youth of this region can achieve are devastating. And another reason why you see this administration pushing for diplomacy, pushing for restorations of calm, because it's thinking about the civilian and the human security toll. I'll leave it there.
Well, this begs the question about what next Gaza. Dennis, I think I'm afraid to say that a year after October 7th, it appears as though everyone is settling into an unsatisfying status quo. Hamas, yes, diminished, yes, broken militarily, but still with enough residual power to deny anyone else the ability to govern and to cow the local population. The Israelis coming in and out, not heavy military operations, but there doesn't seem anything to replace it. And it's difficult to imagine Yahya Sinwar today agreeing to give up the last of his hostages, seeing what happened to Hassan Nasrallah as a clear alternative future for him. What do we do with Gaza when we think about the next year?
Look, I think we should broaden Gaza to also consider the Palestinian issue more generally. Hamas didn't carry out October 7th because they wanted to pursue a Palestinian state. They didn't carry out October 7th because they want a two-state solution or outcome. They did it because their aim is literally resistance and destruction of Israel. They hope to set the whole region on fire so that Israel would be fighting not just on 7 fronts, but they would have been taking 150,000 rockets or 4,000 rockets a day from Hezbollah. They didn't succeed. They didn't succeed in that. But the reality is the Palestinian issue is, again, very prominent internationally. And any approach to Gaza is going to also have to be seen as being somehow connected to the Palestinian issue more generally. I say that because it's pretty clear there is a readiness on the part of a number of Arab states, starting with the UAE, to play a role, a significant role in a post-war reality in Gaza. There is an increasing consensus, I believe, in terms of creating some kind of international/regional administration for an interim period in Gaza. Clearly, Hamas will not be ruling. I don't think Hamas is in much of a capability to rule, although it's in a position to continue to try to intimidate. But the truth is, the more that you create an Arab involvement there, the more you create a kind of international sanction for this, or an international umbrella for this. We've seen signs of how Hamas has lost complete support within Gaza. There's a poll out now, a Zogby poll, that shows 7% of Gazans would like to see Hamas still in control of Gaza when this is over. That's pretty extraordinary. And it shows that if, in fact, you can end the war and you bring in this kind of interim administration that will involve Arabs and probably Palestinians who've been part of the functional responsibilities day to day, you can create a difference. And Hamas, I think, would not be in a position to resist that. They'd be under a very different kind of pressure. I would say, when I say you got to bring the war to an end, that's sort of easy to do. We've had the administration which operated on a premise which would
say.
Sorry?
You mean it's easy to say?
It's very easy to say, yes. Not easy to do, yes. But what we've had the administration with an approach that was moral and logical, but was based on a hostage deal that set in motion pauses which would make it difficult to resume the war, which would allow you to fix a humanitarian situation, which would allow you to finalize a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal with a Palestinian dimension. And the problem was that allowed Sinwar to be the arbiter of whether you could succeed. And he was never going to accept that kind of an approach. But if you focus more on taking what Israel has achieved and say, defining it as a success, Hamas is no longer a military. Israel has destroyed most of the military infrastructure. Prime Minister Netanyahu said publicly from the UN, they've destroyed 90% of the rockets, most of the weapons depots, most of the weapons labs, most of the weapons production facilities, at least half of the tunnels. If you can then focus on ensuring that Hamas can't reconstitute itself because you come up with mechanisms to shut off the smuggling, which is possible. You create multilateral approaches to cutting off the money to Hamas, which is also possible. You make sure that any reconstruction has a mechanism to ensure there can be no diversion of material. Then Hamas can't reconstitute itself. That's also a message to the people of Gaza. If they can't reconstitute themselves, they're going to shrivel over time. You do all that and you create this mechanism for an interim administration and rule within Gaza. And you focus also on seriously reforming the Palestinian Authority. If Arab states were to make it clear to Abu Mazen their readiness to support the PA practically and materially, and him for the future, would depend upon real reform, which means you bring in either a deputy or a new prime minister who is empowered to carry out reform, you then begin to have an approach on the Palestinians and the post Gaza situation that we don't have right now.
Okay, Dana, you want to get in on this?
I want to offer the observation that we're at risk, Israel's at risk 1 year after October 7th of defining its achievements in Gaza exclusively through the military lens and military tools. And unfortunately, the United States and its experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, and even before that, and the international community has already learned very tough lessons that without a human or a civilian-centric approach to what comes after the fighting, when the fighting ends, without a consensus on what that political framework looks like to answer those tough questions, you are at risk of losing the strategic objective here, which is ensuring that what comes out of Gaza is not an existential threat to Israel or a threat that has to be focused on as opposed to the other ones. So what civilians in Gaza want is not just to think about the humanitarian aid that they can get. They want to know about next steps. When can they return to their lives? What will be left for their children? And these cannot be answered exclusively through IDF military operations. It's going to require difficult policy discussions with Israel, with the United States. And frankly, again, this is where, in terms of the regional, what is the political outcome that follows military operations? Washington has a critical role to play in organizing and convening and starting to define those critical questions, again, for what comes next in Gaza.
So, David, on this issue, it's unfair for me to ask you to get inside Donald Trump's head. But he has said something which is sort of interesting, which is allegedly he said to the Prime Minister of Israel, just get it done, just finish. What does he mean? What outcome, what does he want to be finished?
Well, of course, I can't get into
Fair enough.
Trump's mind, but let me say, I think first of all, the general view I think of the president is war is not only bad, but it's bad for business, right? There's human suffering, but there's no prosperity. You can't get done what you want to get done. He said the same about Ukraine. Right, we got to end this war right now, and I think it's in a different context, right? In Israel, in Gaza, I think he very much wants Israel to win, as opposed to perhaps Ukraine, where he may be more neutral about the end game. No, he wants the war over. This is not good for. It's not only bad for Palestinians in the long run; it's bad for Israel. If you have a society that's at war, your GDP is going down. The high tech startup nation is their GDP is flat. People are leaving the country. It's not appealing in a number of ways for people to move there, et cetera. I think he's viewing this in sort of that type of context. And if you're going to do something militarily, it's best to do it ferociously and to wrap it up.
Okay, let me stick with you for a minute. I want to follow up on Dennis's opening remark about a potential moment of opportunity and ask you. I know that you spent a lot of time in your last incarnation in the State Department focusing on Lebanon, relations with the Lebanon armed forces, et cetera. How would the United States take advantage of this moment of opportunity, disarray of Hezbollah, death of Nasrallah, Israeli incursion into South Lebanon that quite remarkably the United States from the White House endorsed? How would we take advantage of this moment of opportunity?
Well, let me caveat what I'm going to say from the very beginning by saying, we can have a great plan, but much of it is going to depend on whether we have Lebanese partners and how courageous and committed our Lebanese partners are. But the idea is, Hezbollah has, with Iranian support, Syrian support, dominated Lebanon for decades, both politically and militarily, intimidating all sorts of opposition and worse, killing political opponents. The idea is now that Hezbollah has at least temporarily been cut down to size by Israel, that there's a possibility for a different arrangement. And that is the United States coming in with the French in the lead and laying out a proposal here for different types of reforms, for getting the LAF to do things not only ultimately in the South, but also in the cities, providing security, having a presence where they have a role. All this will take a great deal of commitment and bravery from Lebanon's political elite, something that typically, bravery and commitment is not mentioned in the same sentence as when we talk about political leadership of Lebanon. That they're going to have to go and eventually deploy these people to the South. And sooner or later, it has been longstanding U.S. policy, whether it's a good idea or not, that ultimately what is Hezbollah would be incorporated into the Lebanese armed forces. That's way down the road here. But the idea is that the central government actually starts to play a role in sovereignty in South Lebanon, and that there might be a possibility ultimately for these UN Security Council resolutions that are on the books for 17 years or 18 years to finally be implemented. But once again, we can work on that. Our French partners can work on that. But we're going to need Lebanese partners ultimately.
Okay, very good. We only have a few minutes left in today's hour, and there's lots to discuss. But I'm afraid I'm going to put all three of you on the bit of a spot here. Today we're recalling a year ago on the events of October 7th. We looked back at how this impacted American policy, and we've begun to look forward at the challenges that any new administration will have after January. So if you guys could please look into your crystal ball when we have this event next October. What are we likely to be facing? Give me a reasonably good scenario, and give me a sadly but yet realistically not so good scenario of what the challenge America and its partners will be facing in this arena a year from now. Dennis?
I'll give you the two scenarios, and I'll put the positive one based on a premise. The premise is that the U.S. and the next administration will decide this actually has to be a priority. As difficult it is to say that, given the challenges in the Indo-Pacific and with China, one thing that also can affect that competition with China is America looking successful, and not just looking successful, but being successful. And by that, I mean in the foreign policy, national security area. I think there is a real potential if we, can help the Israelis define success so they can end the war. I think there's a real potential to reach a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal, because the stake for the Saudis is a defense treaty with us. It will require a Palestinian dimension. It will require difficult decisions by the current Israeli government. Those decisions cannot be defined by two ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. It means that Israel will be prepared to accept what amounts to a critical pathway towards a Palestinian state, where you have a series of benchmarks that have to be achieved before there could be such a Palestinian state. We have a tendency always, when we talk about the Palestinians and Palestinian statehood, no one ever talks about their responsibilities. Palestinians have rights. I think as a people, they have a right to self-determination, but they can't act on that right unless they're prepared to fulfill a set of responsibilities, so that the state, in fact, is a stable one, not a failed one. So the state is a contributor to coexistence and to peace. That, I think, is a real possibility if in fact there is American leadership to help find a way to end the conflict, to focus on normalization, to convey to the Iranians that, in fact, on their nuclear issue, and again, the more we are active in terms of this, the Iranians need to understand that they could put their entire nuclear infrastructure at risk a $500 billion investment. And they had to believe that we would actually act on that. Now, if that happens, I think a year from now, the Middle East can look dramatically better than it does. That's the good scenario. And it requires American leadership and acceptance by the next administration that we can transform things much for the better, but it will take American leadership and a kind of whole of government effort to do that. Now, the bad scenario is one where we don't do that. And we fall back into, we create a kind of new status quo. The Iranians will be determined to go ahead and rebuild Hezbollah, that we don't end up being active enough in Lebanon. We don't have the Lebanese partners. Israel will have bought time, both in terms of its northern and its, and the western fronts, meaning Gaza, but it will still face problems down the road. We will see our friends, rather than stepping up and doing more, will basically decide they can think about, how do they hedge their bets. So I could see a scenario where the Middle East isn't much changed, except you've bought some time. We're still going to face a threat of the Iranian nuclear issue. I hope whoever becomes president will say very explicitly, no nuclear weapon on my watch, because in the next 4 years, the Iranians could have a nuclear weapon unless we act to ensure that doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you. Dana.
I will start with the rosy scenario, which is if we think about the ways in which the fear barrier about what Iran can do to further destabilize the region has been pushed back against in the past year. There has been demonstration that a ballistic and drone attack from Iran can be defeated. There is clear proof of concept that there is regional will and international will from Europe to work with the United States and Israel in an air defense coalition that can defeat these kinds of attacks. And yesterday, very sophisticated Israeli air defense system showed that it could defend with no casualties or no deaths other than one, a complex Iranian ballistic missile attack. And now Israel has demonstrated that Iran's proxies and indeed its partners can be taken on, given what they have done in Lebanon. So with the demonstration that through multilateral military coordination, Iran's proxies and in fact Iran itself can be defended against, and that we can actually succeed in degrading Iran's proxy network. And next October will also be very close to the expiration of the rest of the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program that were brought into force through a United Nations Security Council resolution during the Obama administration with the Iran nuclear agreement, which means that there will be tremendous focus over the next year on Iran's nuclear program. So the rosy picture is that there actually is a whole of government strategy, that the United States does lean into coordinating transatlantically, and that it consults with the region and with Europe and comes up with a multi-vector pressure campaign on Iran to offer it a different path, because we have demonstrated that Iran's conventional capabilities can be challenged, that Iran's proxy networks can be challenged, and still there are opportunities for snapback and other kinds of mechanisms to pressure on Iran's nuclear program.
That's the good.
The less rosy scenario that I do worry about is a year from now, the IDF is still in Gaza, that there is no progress on a political horizon for a Palestinian state, because Israeli society or the Israeli governing coalition will not be able to entertain the kinds of policy changes necessary to bring in international and regional cooperation to imagine and start to put in place a post-Hamas Gaza.
Okay, thank you. And David.
It's tough going to last on this. Let me say the rosy picture. Israel's deterrence is reestablished. We have an Iran strategy. The U.S. is perceived as serious because we've started to do things in the Red Sea. We attract more a bigger coalition of the willing, and I think by virtue of that, we expand the Abraham Accords. We are winning. The opposite side, we don't secure Bab el-Mandeb. We we continue our pivot to Asia. There's a lack of confidence in the U.S. presence and ongoing presence and commitment to the region. We withdraw from Iraq. We withdraw from Syria. We turn this back over to the axis of the resistance. The Hashid has a full takeover. The Iranian-backed militias have a full takeover of Iraq. ISIS is running around in Syria. There is a clear line of communication between Iraq and Lebanon once again. Hezbollah reconstitutes. Jordan is threatened, already under tremendous stress. And of course, Iran runs straight toward the nuke. Awful. But I'm optimistic that even if, we try everything and then we try the right thing and we succeed.
So, of course, when one thinks about the Middle East, these two alternative views, chances are likely there'll be a gray outcome when we come back a year from now.
That's right.
We will attempt to do some of this. We will be successful in some of it, perhaps not all of it. But we here at the Institute will do our best to help offer analysis, advice, and ideas to help tilt the balance in the positive direction and limit our inability to achieve the objectives that you guys just described. Look, I want to thank you all. This is a difficult moment for many people, especially those that have been so deeply involved in the events since October 7th, the pursuit of freedom for the hostages, the effort to provide as much humanitarian support to the civilians caught in conflict. I know many Americans were deeply involved in all these sorts of issues, and I know that my colleagues have all been deeply involved in these issues. And I want to thank you all for what you have done over the past year. So, friends, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to having you back at our next session here of experts speaking on critical Middle East issues at the Washington Institute. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.